This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Kathryn and I are thrilled to be joined by Scott James. Scott Andrew James is a poet who believes in everyday magic. His work explores the nature of transformation and the healing power of creativity. He performs watercolor and typewriter poetry across the country, taking requests to create poems in the moment. He lives in Austin, Texas with his wife, daughter, and their pug. For more about his work, visit scottandrewjames.com. Welcome, Scott.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, we are delighted. So we thought we would start by talking about poetry since you are a poet, and that's kind of a privileged position on our show because we're such heavy, hardcore prose writers. I'm excited to bring a new perspective.
Yeah, let's let the poets come to play. I love prose, all kinds of writing. I studied literature in college and taught it for a while, so it's not completely foreign territory. Right.
Well, how can we prose writers use poetry, or if not poetry per se, a poet's sensibility to improve our writing?
Yeah. So I think the main takeaway that I have from a lifetime of poetry writing is that the less words, the better. So the thing about poetry is, unless you're going to do, a really long form on purpose, you're always using as few words, not really as possible, but you're focusing on one image or one detail. And I find this to be true in really powerful prose as well. But in poetry, most of the time, that's what you're doing. So in a nutshell, the most prose writers, I'll tell you, so 6-ish years ago, I wrote a novel, which was a stretch goal for me. And I started it off with NaNoWriMo. So I'm sure a lot of people out there listening to this have done that or done a version of it. And I found it really challenging to say, I'm going to write, X number of hundreds of words every day, just because that was a huge stretch goal for me. And I found myself writing a lot, and I found myself finding a big community of people who were doing that. And that was how the goals were structured. How much can you write? How many hours can you write? And just pumping word count. And I also have worked as a professional copywriter, and the same thing. A lot of times you just have to write and just sort of like vomit up a first draft. And that's not the case with poetry. And I think that's a huge lesson. Pumping word count is, of course, necessary to create a novel or a book. But pumping word count at the expense of valuing a particular image or one or two words, even at the rough draft stage, is, I think, not a blind spot, but it's an opportunity for anybody that writes prose to just allow that, because that's how the poetic mind works. You get caught by, or at least that's how mine works. You get caught by one image, and it's not just one in 200 words. Like, that's the thing.
Yeah. So is there a takeaway about quality versus quantity here when we talk about building that word count to a novel versus finding that focus? Kathryn, I'm going to throw this one to you as a fellow novelist. Like, do you ever feel like the push to, say, get a chapter done or to get a word count goal in for a day leads to a sacrifice in quality?
I think sometimes, yes. I think other times I have to pump out a certain number of words before I find that ability to focus on the words. You know what I mean? Like where I just have to get through to get to the place where I want. And sometimes that means that I'm rewriting the same image a couple of times, even while I'm drafting, to try and get to, no, that's not what I was seeing, or that's not what I was feeling it needed to be. So I feel like there's an argument for sure about like too many words, you're not really focusing on any individual thing. But I also find that like sometimes for me, I gotta get them out in order to get down to the nitty gritty and the detail, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It does, yeah. And when you wrote your novel, Scott, when you were doing NaNoWriMo, did you find that working toward the word count goal was a positive or a negative ultimately?
I wouldn't think of it in those terms. I didn't like it. So it reminded me not to, at least for the last 10 years, write novels. And that's just a subjective opinion. So yeah, mm-hmm. I think it helped. I had to do it to get a book. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So are there any tools or tips or tricks or any advice you can give us for when we are crafting that one image, say, or that one line, and we want to nail it? How do you as a poet go about finding just the right word or just the right rhythm? What is the process like?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and maybe this is even more applicable than comparing it to word count. So I in addition to writing poetry in general, I do public typewriter poetry. So some people out there will have seen this. For some people, they've never heard of it. So real quick, I take this old typewriter, which is actually back there, 1946 model, and I set it up at an event or sometimes like at a food truck court or at a park, and just put up a sign that says, free poems or poems on demand. And then one person at a time, this is pre-COVID, of course, would come up and either tell me a story or ask me a question, or I might ask them and they tell me about something that's going on in their life. And then I'm suddenly writing a poem like as a gift for their mother or for their child or for them, because they're transitioning to a new job or they're getting a divorce or they're about to start moving somewhere. So a lot of times what happens is there's narrative in the poem. So there's this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. And where the poetry really has a lot of power is in the summation phrase at the end. So I think the answer to your question is that the power is this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, and then the last sentence might be, and I am the gentle wind, for example.
Yeah.
So, you just riffing on something here, you might say, we are talking, we are discussing, there are children, and there are our future selves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we are the voices in the air. So the economy of words there would be like the summation phrase, which is the reason that sounds cool, at least I think, is because it's sort of taking two images that don't, we are the gentle wind, we are the voices in the air. It's like they don't quite match. And you use one adjective only. And the sentence is like 5 or 6 words. And so if you have like a bunch of sentences in a paragraph, for example, that are whatever it is, and they might be important, I'm not trivializing them, but then if you end it with a 5 or 6 word sentence, that basically uses an interesting, playful combination of an adjective and a noun. That is, to me, the poetic, the power of poetry. And that can be injected into any prose, and it works in commercial copywriting too.
Mm-hmm. So my question would be, how do you work on developing that? How do you start practicing incorporating poetry in your prose? If, like, for instance, myself, I don't read poetry necessarily, and I don't write poetry.
Yeah.
So how could I incorporate that in a way that for me is still, developing myself without feeling like I'm just beating myself over the head with something I don't understand?
Oh, interesting. Can I ask you a question back before answering? Like, what do you mean something that you don't understand?
I think it's probably just that I would feel overwhelmed at starting something labeled poetry, right? Even though it's still wordcraft, even though it's still something that I would play with as a writer, because it's not really in my scope of normal. It would make me feel a little bit like I'm delving into something that maybe I don't fully understand the mechanics of, or the workings of, or maybe the power of. Does that make sense?
Yes. Well, what I would say is, just like most writing, it's play. It's really just play. And so I like to practice with conversation. And so whenever I'm talking to people, I will do what I just did. Like, I might say, "Oh, so you're asking an ephemeral question," or, "Oh, so you're asking like it's a summation type sentence." And whether I say it out loud or I say it in my own head, I try to play with, like, what is the most creative 2-word description I can come up with for what's happening right now. And so I do that all the time. So that's my, blessing, curse, mental habit. So I'm sure that prose writers, and both of you, have your own. But I would say that is a fun way. So if you live with someone, or if you have someone that you talk with frequently, trying it out with them, it's a fun game, and that's how to sort of get it into the rhythm, in my opinion. And in writing, if you're pumping word count, it can be something that you incorporate. Like, if you're doing 500 words a day, for example, every 250 words, do this. Create a punch sentence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found when I was in graduate school, we had to take a foundations course and work with all 3 genres: fiction, CNF, and poetry. So that was the one semester I had a dose of poetry and a dose of CNF thrown at me. And, sometimes poetry can feel like abstract art, like you're looking at the block of blue with a red slash across it going, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know why that's art. And other times poetry can be very precise and imagistic or conceptual. And then, okay, it's like that bell chimes. Oh, okay, there's this thing. And it might feel ephemeral, right? But it's there. And then there are other poems, longer poems, that feel more narrative in structure, more like they have a story or an event or something, almost like flash fiction, but if you cut away most of the words, and structure it for the rhythm and the sound. And I think Mary Oliver was a poet I was exposed to in that class and really appreciated. So I'll just throw that out there for other prose writers who want to read some poetry.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
It's not all abstract. Go find one you like.
Yeah. Well, let's Do we have time to look at Mary Oliver? I love her. I've got a Mary Oliver book on the floor right here.
Well, heck yeah. Bring it on.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Well, here I got it. Yeah. So we'll take Wild Geese because, it's amazing. Mary Oliver is like one of my favorite poets of all time.
Excellent.
So Wild Geese, right? I'll just read it. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing yourself, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. So when I hear that, first of all, she's so good.
Yeah. Are you ready to take your storycraft to the next level? StoryWorks Fiction Online School has courses available right now, from micro courses on character traits to master level workshops on plot and building characters. There are also live workshops with your instructor in the classroom with you every week, guiding your progress and workshopping your manuscripts along the way. All students enrolled in StoryWorks Fiction, whether active in a class or not, can take advantage of the monthly free live Q&A calls with Alida. Check out storyworksfiction.com today and take your storycraft to the next level.
I take a line like, meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, she talks about all of this, and then she ends with announcing your place in the family of things. So to me, the summation sentence is announcing your place in the family of things. Like the poem is, all these things are happening. First of all, she addresses you, which is interesting. And that's not always the case. It's like breaking the camera wall in prose, I suppose, but summating with, the family of things is, to me, a closing image that doesn't use too many. It's one descriptor and it's one noun, and it just is allowed to sit there, and it does the heavy lifting. That's what's happening. And, it's an epic detail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's really a beautiful end note for that poem. I talk with my writers a lot about the end note. When you finish a scene and you get to that scene break or you get to that chapter break, you want to leave something that is going to resonate with the reader, where they finish that, they get to the white space, and there's a takeaway. If they put the bookmark in there, they don't think what's for dinner. They think, wow, okay, I'm sitting with that. I'm sitting with that image. I'm sitting with that moment. I'm carrying it forward, and that's really a key quality of poetry, and when you were talking about the process of crafting your poetry, I thought it was very interesting because I was thinking, oh, in prose, we're building up, building up, building up, adding all of these words. And in poetry, it's so refined, it's so refined. But then you described actually a build up to that summation statement. And I thought, oh, actually, there's more similarity here than I was imagining. Do you want to talk a little bit about the resonance, the end note in poetry, and how to strive for that, or how to not strive, how to capture it?
Yeah. Well, one other thing about Wild Geese, and I'll tie it into the end note. Like, another sentence that she has is, meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes. So the only adjective in that entire sentence is clear. And it describes pebbles, which to me, that's like a super poetry move, as opposed to what I would think of as like, if you were setting the scene in prose, you wouldn't say, meanwhile, the sun, and just call it the sun. You would probably, describe the sun, or how the sun feels, or the sun taking an action. And it's fascinating to me that like that is the kind of move that poetry makes all the time. Like, she just says the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain. That's the only, I guess clear pebbles is describing the rain, but really just clear, like clear and pebbles don't work together. That's why it works. But it also works because she didn't describe the sun at all. And then after that are moving across the landscapes. Landscape is about as general as it gets. So, but she adds the letter S, so it's the landscapes, which is just, it's genius, that she didn't try to give the landscape a personality, or the dry landscapes. Even just adding that would have sort of cheapened that whole stanza. So like the economy of choosing, like, I'm only going to describe one element in this thing, gives it this whole like force. And so choosing that.
Right.
And I think the end note is that way. So ending the summating sentence, or the end note, to me, ending with a detail that is interesting in that way, like clear pebble or gentle wind, is that is a technique. That is something that I realized I didn't set out to do, but when I started doing typewriter poetry, I wrote like 1,000 in a year, and my first couple hundred were really wordy, and I was trying to impress people. And by the end of the year, I realized, people respond when I tell their story back to them in broad strokes. And I end with an image that they have not used to describe themselves before, that they can take home. And so I'd say it's similar to what you're talking about, as far as closing the chapter. So I think that's a huge thing in poetry.
Yes. Yeah, it is. And, when you're reading a novel, sometimes you come across one of those sentences that kind of takes your breath away, and you have to stop and reread it because that individual sentence is so beautiful. And when you were talking about that line with the sun, the clear pebbles of the rain, and the landscapes, I thought, when you're describing a scene, you might describe the heat of the sun, and you have a subject, you've got the character, or maybe it's all narrative if you're setting a stage. But if we're looking at just a single sentence and really making your sentences shine, taking this lesson, this takeaway from your reading and discussion of Mary Oliver's poem, picking that one element, the clear pebbles of the rain, in giving it that beautiful, the image, the juxtaposition of clear and pebbles, and making it a metaphor for the raindrops and such, then you don't need to describe the sun and you don't need to describe the landscape. And that as a sentence is beautiful. That's one of those poetic lines that you come across in prose and, kind of, wow.
Yeah. Like a Cormac McCarthy book or something. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So would you tell us a little more about your work and how you, how you come to those final lines that speak back to somebody, their experience, and maybe read a couple of your favorite poems to us if you don't mind.
For sure. Well, as I said, I started out, basically I was sort of languishing in an office job, which I later realized had very little to do with the job, because the job was in publishing, which I still love, and it had a lot to do with the office. So the way that I found my way, like spiritually and emotionally out of that, was to start what I call the journey of 1,000 poems, which was, I had an artist friend who did this with paintings. He painted a painting a day for a year. Josh Coffey. He's great. He's based in San Francisco. Everybody go look him up. He called it the gift prolific. So I stole his idea and applied it to poetry. And I said, I'm going to write not a poem a day, but I'm going to write 1,000 poems in a year. And I think I stole the 1,000 from somebody else who said, you should pick a number and it should be an ambitious number, but not so ambitious that it's undoable. So I didn't realize what I was in for. So I started that, and the first couple hundred poems, like I said, were really wordy, and I was trying to write good poems. And I found that I couldn't do that, and I ran out of ideas, for sure. After 300 poems, I was like, I only ever think about these 82 things, and it's so boring now. So I need suggestions.
Right.
So I started going out to a party or to a, food truck court or wherever, a park, call my friends. And so people would offer suggestions. And what I realized is, if I think of the poem as a gift and not a test, it's much easier. And if I think of what I'm writing as just telling that person how I see them, it flows, or giving them an option, giving them an image, giving them a ticket almost to take a journey into a self-concept that they may not have had walking up. They walk up with a problem or a story, and they're kind of what do I do with this? How do I tell my mom I love her? How do I tell my heart that I will get over, this person leaving me, or me leaving this person? And so it's very vulnerable. And so having that moment and basically accepting the challenge and saying, I'm going to choose to just give you something which you can pick up or leave on the side of the road. It's up to you. I'm going to do that and treat it as a gift. That is how I arrive at the end image. And so tactically, I use what I described, I like to have a summation sentence, but spiritually or mythically, what I'm doing is saying, okay, I will, whatever you say out loud is not the whole story. And you don't want me to write something. This is my interpretation. Or I don't want to write you something that is obvious. I want to write you something that invites you to sort of go play with it. And so that has allowed me to do an end run around writer's block, or what do I write next? I don't know. And it's also allowed me.
It sounds like people really.
Go ahead.
People really open up to you at these events, don't they? It reminds me of Lucy and Peanuts with her little booth. The therapist is in 5 cents. Like people just walk up to a guy with a typewriter and say, let me open my heart or spill my guts to you. Do you ever find your poem as a result of what they share is there ever any hesitancy to give it away? Is it ever like, ooh, that one's good. I gotta keep that image in my bank, or I've gotta get that on paper after this person walks away?
Sure. Well, I never lose anything because I always take a picture. So I have them all. 5,000, 10,000, whatever, Okay. I have them all in, my Mac. They're all in there if I want to dig them up.
Nice.
But I have found that if I hoard them, then they stop coming, because it's more just you're in service to the muse. And if it's really good, I'll take a little note. But also, I don't know, that's a great question. No, the answer is no. I have learned to distrust the impulse to keep it for myself, because giving it away is it multiplies it tenfold.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Wow.
So,
well, what would you like to read for us today?
Well, I'll read 2 poems. And these are both written. One is called Bamboo Blues. We planted the bamboo as if it would just grow. But it turns out it needs love and water, just like us.
It's beautiful.
So that was me and my wife trying to plant bamboo along the fence line of our first house, which it went poorly. But we did learn a good lesson.
Lessons.
Yes. Marriage is fine. Bamboo is, stagnant. Yeah, and then this other one is Clarity. And this poem is, the poem itself is very short, but I would say the poem itself is a summation statement after 3 or 4 years of finding sobriety and clarity just around like life purpose. So, yeah. I am not who I thought I was. And for that, I am forever grateful.
Yeah, that's one of those end notes that's just profound. I'm going to carry that through the rest of my day,
Cool.
Definitely. Where can people find your book? And is there anything you want to say about the book itself, the process of making it? This is a really special collection because it's printed in color with your watercolors adorning each of the poems. So what would you like to share with our listeners about your book?
It's exclusively on Amazon. I would love for anyone to go check it out. And it is written to be read. So it's not long. The goal was to create a book that you could sit down and have coffee with, that you could read and not be intimidated by. My public poetry led me to a place where I really like to write poems for people who would never buy a book of poems. And because of that, most of them are sold as gifts. So it's interesting how like writing them as gifts has, propagated itself as sort of the use of the book as well. So I'd say if you have a person, I titled it Whatever Magic You Need, because there are the goal of each poem is to leave you with sort of that close the chapter feeling like you were talking about before. And I would think of it as if you have someone in your life that, is hard to buy for, or they're the deep thinker, or they're the person who needs a moment of respite, give them this book and they will be happy about it, because that's what it's for.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you so much for talking with us about poetry today. And we will link to your site in the show notes.
Yeah.
If you're listening to this podcast, you are probably a writer, and you've maybe heard me talk about the StoryWorks reading series. It is the new branch in the StoryWorks family tree. It is a literary journal podcast. That's right, a hybrid, a literary journal for your ears, with a print anthology at the end of the year of the best of the podcast. I am open for submissions, and I want to see your best prose right now. I am taking both fiction and creative nonfiction. You can read the guidelines and submit your work at storyworkspodcast.com/submit. What are you waiting for? It's time to see your stories published and sit on the other side of this microphone from me. Have a conversation about your storycraft. Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.